All right, everybody. Um, Next up, chapter 2. So we're going to start to look at the variables that impact people's political decision-making process. Okay, but before we get into that, I just want to quickly revisit the game framework that we are going to use to evaluate and analyze different political phenomena. So, if we remember the major aspects of games, we will remember players, stakes, the rules of the game, and the strategies and tactics that various actors use to ultimately win the games that they engage in. So, with the basic aspects of games, we need to remember that our games fall under three broader categories. Those categories are destruction, in which the goal is to ultimately destroy whatever the rival group is. Accommodation, which is based on the cooperation between players to achieve a mutually beneficial outcome. And lastly, games of conversion, in which we attempt to get that rival group to come over to our side or otherwise adopt the outcome that most benefits ourselves. So, moving away from that game framework, we're going to now start to look at the ideas of political choice and political decision making. Now, the study of political choice and decision making is a incomplete science, right? We're a social science. We don't have the luxury of having a laboratory like we might in chemistry or biology or those other hard sciences that allow us to control for different variables and ultimately discover hard truths regarding things like decision-making processes, etc. So let's think about why it's so difficult to have a scientific approach or a scientific study of political decision making. First, people are hard to predict, right? People do odd things. People act outside their interests. As such, it becomes difficult to make generalizations about what people are going to do. It's also difficult to establish facts, okay? We're operating within an environment of incomplete information. Again, we can't control for all those different impacts that might lead a person to decide on one path or the other. Incomplete information, it's difficult to establish facts. Nevertheless, facts play a role in the decision-making process, but so do values and judgments. So we're going to talk about these three major factors that impact decision making: facts, values, judgment. So facts are a piece of information which represents some sort of objective truth, okay? And we come to know facts through observation or experience. These are things that we see, we can measure, we can touch, we can feel. Over the course of our political life, we start to identify truths that we can draw upon. So, facts are important. Also, values. Okay? Values shape the decisions that we make. Values are a person's principles. They are a person's standards of behavior. It's a person's judgment of what's important in their particular life. So it has to do with what do we want, right? Our values have to do with what we want. Where do we get our values? Well, we get them from socialization. We get them from our upbringing. Values are developed through things like perhaps our religion that we ascribe to, the culture with which we're born and raised. Okay. Now, what's important to note are values are different. What I find as right and proper are probably different from many of you as well. And this leads to oftentimes political disagreement, etc. So the last factor that impacts political decision making is judgment. Okay? And judgment is the ability for us to make considered decisions or to come up with some sort of sensible conclusion. Okay? So we have incomplete information, our facts might not be as strong as we hoped. So our decision has to also rely on judgment, right? So where does judgment come from? A lot of it is from experience, okay? We talk about older people being wise. Well, they're wise because they have experience. They can make judgment on incomplete information in order to pursue their own goals, especially in this case in political decision making. So the overall topic of this week is political decision making. And what we're going to look at in greater detail are 5 different themes in which people make political decisions. These themes include political obligation, political creativity, responsible citizenship, power politics, and the use of accurate information and assumptions. So, political obligation. This is, why do we choose to obey those in power? How do we decide to obey those who demand allegiance from us? For example, why do we obey a government, a state, a law, etc.? Why would someone agree to be drafted by their country, go to war, possibly die, or kill people? Why wouldn't we just say, nope, I'm not going to do that? Okay? So when we're asking questions about political obligation, we're really talking about what makes a government legitimate. What makes a government entitled to our obedience, our respect, and our allegiance. These are questions, political questions, that we have to address based on political obligation. Second theme that we often address in political science is political creativity. Okay, so these are going to be questions that have to do with achieving a new and improved understanding of politics. Can we build something better? Okay, if we're discontent with our current situation, well, how do we build something, maybe something more ethical, something more equitable? We're going to have to address questions of reconciling liberty and equality, things like this, right? How do we formulate a state? Again, political decision making. Third, we're going to address themes about responsible citizenship. Can we, as citizens, respond sensibly to social, economic, and political crises? Okay? Generally in the United States, we live in a very comfortable time. People have food, people have shelter, people are reasonably safe. Well, what happens if it were to go sideways, right? If things were to go terrible, if we were to have some sort of social or political collapse, how would people react? How would you react? What decisions would you make within this political arena? We also address issues of power politics. We know that power is the ability of one person or group of people to essentially impose their will on others. Okay? Well, how do we do this in a sensible manner? We know games of destruction are very costly. So we have to think about, how do we create a decision-making process that ensures a positive outcome while still engaging in some sort of conflict of power. Lastly, we have to think about decisions in times of uncertainty, particularly in times where information is uncertain. How do we make these assumptions when we don't have all the facts, or when we're under a tremendous amount of pressure to act quickly? Okay, so these are the major themes in which political decisions are made: political obligation, political creativity, responsible citizenship, power politics, and operating in an environment of information uncertainty. So in this week's chapter, we're going to look at 5 cases in which political decisions were made based on our particular themes. So we begin with Socrates, and I'm not going to belabor these cases too much. You can read them on your own. But Socrates' main question was, what is the obligation we have to the state? Okay? For Socrates, he ultimately gave his own life as because he viewed it as an obligation to the state. The state actually killed Socrates. However, he felt that he owed a certain allegiance to that particular government. Now, the next one is James Madison, one of the founders of the United States, who had to address issues of creativity, right? He sought to develop a new state, something dramatically different from anything that had existed previously. So in that case, we start to see how his decision-making process operated in this realm of political creativity. The next one has to do with the ability of people to make informed and accurate decisions. So we're going to look at the case of Nazi Germany. What many people don't realize is that Adolf Hitler was democratically elected by the German people. What an interesting political decision on the part of the German public. So we'll start to see that decision-making process through this the German lens. We'll also start to look at John F. Kennedy's decisions during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which ultimately averted what could have been a terrible nuclear holocaust between the United States and Russia. And lastly, we're going to look at decision-making in an environment of information, inaccuracies, and faulty assumptions. So specifically, we're going to look at President George Bush and his decision to invade Iraq in 2003. So, take a look at these cases and start to think about how did these actors make decisions in a world of faulty information, poor assumptions, etc. Okay?